Hello, my name is Max. I have Asperger syndrome. This video is the fifth part of a series of videos where I address the various symptoms of AS and give vivid examples of these symptoms from my own life. Briefly, before we begin, in case you haven't watched the first video and are not inclined to, refer to the description box for my Modus Operandi. It will only take a few seconds to read and might provide you with worthwhile context for the rest of this video and the series. For this video, I'll be addressing a symptom of AS that is arguably both our greatest weakness and our greatest strength: narrow interests. Unlike the average person who has their hobbies and passions, people with AS will develop intense fixations over very specific things. While these fixations may include simple, everyday items like toys, movies, and books, more often than not, these fixations involve complicated subjects and mediums. People with AS embrace complex interests because they possess an aptitude for these interests, whereas the average person might not. It is through mastering fields that discriminate in favor of intellectual competence, fields that very few people can do, that they can create a positive identity for themselves. Upon discovering one's intense interest, a whole new world of possibility, opportunity, and hope manifests. For instance, not everybody wants to learn how to make watches, often because they either don't have the intellect or the temperament in order to learn, and also because it is such a unique discipline. However, people with AS are more likely to engage in fields like watchmaking because of their complexity and because they are so unlike other professions. This has to do with the fact that people with AS are confined to some degree by their neurological sensory sensitivity. Our brains are built in such a way that when we perceive and engage with the world, we tend to do so more intensely than the average person. When we like something, our brain responds to the stimuli of the thing we like so much more positively and so much more intensely compared to the average person. When you combine that positive feeling with the fact that people with AS often possess higher than average intelligence, then extraordinary results are likely to follow. This is why people with autism often set the standard in their fields of expertise. Bill Gates, co-founder of Microsoft; Stanley Kubrick, famous film director; Charles Darwin, authored The Theory of Evolution, and so on and so on. However, while we are programmed to like things more intensely, the same is true of the opposite. When we dislike something, the mechanisms in our brain that regulate emotions of disagreeableness and disgust facilitate a more intense reaction. As I've discussed in previous videos, this is why people with AS are more sensitive to sound, touch, smell, taste, and sight. When encountering something neurologically offensive like a loud noise or an intense work environment, the negative emotion is amplified to such a height that our brain cannot process it. What follows quite often is a meltdown. You thrash about, you scream, you hit your head, all in a futile effort to make your brain cooperate. While the meltdown is horrifying in and of itself, the shame over one's inability to meet the demands of everyday life is what one must deal with between incidents. That shame is supplanted when people insult you for not living up to your responsibilities, for acting like a child, for supposedly whining when things don't go your way. Being insulted like that is hard enough when you have an autism diagnosis, but what if you don't get one until later on in life? When you hear these criticisms so often, you start to believe that you're just a spoiled brat and that you can't handle life, even though you are really trying your best. When that constant effort is met by constant failure and demeaning, what often results is severe depression and sometimes, unfortunately, suicidal ideation. Despite our neurological disposition, the fact of life remains the same. There will be things that we don't want to do in life, but that we have to do anyways. Even though people may have some form of handicap or disability, we have to soldier on. So herein lies the million-dollar question. How does somebody with AS minimize the agony, but also contribute to society on par with the average person? This question becomes even more pertinent when applying it to children because, as we all know, they would like nothing more than to avoid all responsibility and play all day. Let's do a case study. I once talked with a young man with AS who hated washing the dishes. He didn't hate it because it was a chore, but because he couldn't stand the sound the dishes would make if he accidentally banged the porcelain and ceramic together. He compared the noise to somebody sneaking up behind you and blowing an air horn. Naturally, because he was young, his parents thought he didn't want to do the dishes because he was avoiding any form of work or responsibility and scolded him for it. What makes the whole situation more perverse is that when he received his AS diagnosis and said he couldn't do the dishes because he had AS, they said, "Oh, you're just using that as an excuse." With an instance like this, I thought that maybe a good good compromise would be for the parents to substitute their porcelain and ceramics with plastic. Or maybe they could have provided him earplugs when he was washing the dishes. To some of the more disagreeable parents, or even some of the more disagreeable people watching this video, you might say, that's just ridiculous. There's going to be way worse situations in life involving loud noise that he'll have to face. He'll just have to get used to it. In response to that, I'd say, look, do you want your child to succeed, or do you want him to get bitter and resentful because of you? Start small with the dishes, remove any possible excuses he might use, and then build upwards from there. There's a very fine line between pushing your child to face adversity despite the mental pain they might feel, and making sure you don't push them too hard so that they constantly break down. Granted, life's tribulations become much more complex beyond washing the dishes, and figuring out where one's happy medium is in relation to each challenge becomes its own puzzle. I don't have the answer for every individual situation, but what I will do is provide examples from my own life where narrow interests have worked positively and negatively in my favor. Hopefully, my experiences will provide the beginnings of your own personal framework for dealing with these types of issues. I'll start with a lighter example, the least bad example from my life. When I was 8 years old, my parents bought a piano. Prior to that, I had zero desire to learn music. I didn't see what the appeal was. I knew what piano lessons involved according to my peers, and it seemed like torture to me. Yet, I never articulated my feelings at the time. Even if I did, my parents would have forced me to learn piano anyways because of how it boosts several other areas of childhood development. My peers were right. I absolutely hated learning how to play the piano. I hated it with every inch of my being. And don't get me wrong, I excelled at it because even when I was forced to do something I hated, I figured I might as well give it my best effort. The thought of failing in academic discipline when I was younger seemed like the end of the world to a neurotic 8-year-old. However, when I was 13, something interesting happened. I bought the game Guitar Hero 2 and was absolutely obsessed with it. Got 5 stars on every song and on the highest difficulty level. Around this time, my mother floated the idea of buying me a guitar. And when she said that, it was the first time in my life that my parents suggested I do something and I didn't immediately cringe. I said, yeah, that sounds like a cool idea. When they bought me the guitar, obviously I practiced for a few weeks and stopped for a couple of months after that. Pressing my uncalloused fingers against the frets hurt like hell, and I didn't feel like I was getting anywhere. Long story short, I came back to it and found a way to teach myself all of my favorite songs, and I got so addicted to it that I would find myself practicing 4 hours a day. I found myself finally enjoying music because I was teaching myself the way I wanted to be taught. I was discovering the infinite creative possibilities of music that I never would have learned through conventional lessons. After I got good at the guitar, I went back to the piano and taught myself how to play Billy Joel piano solos. My dad bought a drum set, and I was teaching myself how to play Led Zeppelin. My obsession with music finally culminated with me going to university and taking audio production courses. I was in a studio, crafting my own music and other people's music with Pro Tools and an external soundboard. The picture you see on screen is the actual soundboard that I used. The point I'm trying to get across to all of you is that if you have AS or know somebody that does, and they are having a hard time getting motivated to do anything, work with them to find something that they will like doing and that they can do well. You'll find something. It'll probably just take a while. This isn't exclusive to hobbies and chores. The same thing happened with me and finding employment. I've had several jobs, and it is mostly because I've had to leave most of them after 4 months. If you want more detail on my employment history and how they led to meltdowns, I recommend you watch episode 2 in this series, which I'll link in the description box below. Thankfully, that story currently has a happy ending. I finally found a job that caters to my AS symptoms and that I can excel at. Unfortunately, not all examples from my life are as tame as the 2 previously cited. Aside from academic education, my parents were furiously enthusiastic about giving me physical education. This is a tougher case study because very few people like exercising, obviously, and determining whether my reaction to it was on account of laziness or AS is initially hard to discern. It was primarily on account of AS, but I will explain why in a moment. When I was 12, my parents signed me up for Taekwondo. I have never hated doing something so much in my entire life. 3 times a week, I had to go into the sweating hot dojo and basically exercise for an hour straight. It always smelled, mostly because kids often came straight from dinner to the dojo and they were always passing gas. On top of that, I have the pores and hair coverage of a Neanderthal, so I always had sweat running down my back like Niagara. I'm talking pools. By the way, sorry to be gross, but if you're offended by my language, take what you're feeling right now and multiply that by 10. That's how disgusted I was with having to go to Taekwondo. Every day I'd go there, I'd make my displeasure known by kicking over the practice dummies, going into the bathroom and screaming, purposefully standing outside until the instructor would come out and yell at me to go back in, and there were even times where it got so bad that I would be very disrespectful to one or many instructors. I don't know why my parents thought that my salacious behavior was typical of me. They knew that outside of Taekwondo, everybody thought that I was the kindest, most mild-mannered person they'd ever met. And that's not me making stuff up. When I had parent-teacher meetings or times outside of school when my friends' parents would come across my parents, they would constantly go out of their way to tell them how nice and gentle I was. Even when I had to do things I didn't want to, like piano, I wasn't screaming in front of other people or throwing public tantrums. It only happened at Taekwondo. Why the hell they didn't think something was up is beyond me. But still, things get more complicated because my parents told me I could have done any other form of physical activity that I wanted just as long as I did something. And their hearts were in the right place. After all, there is obesity and diabetes on both sides of my family, and they wanted to protect me from that. They were right to pressure me in the sense that I needed to be active, but they could have saved both myself and themselves a whole lot of aggravation if they noticed the symptoms of AS earlier on. While I did find a form of physical activity that I did enjoy doing later on in life, running, at the time I was so overcome by rage and teenage angst that I couldn't think straight. And that's what happens when you're having meltdowns. You're so overcome by sensory overload that you can't put a logical, coherent argument together. You just end up embarrassing yourself in front of a whole bunch of people. Plus, because parents are older and wiser, I just stupidly assumed, as teenagers do, that there was no way out of my predicament regarding physical activity. Anyways, these are just a couple of stories related to me. When it comes to accommodating the narrow interests of people with AS, everybody is different. While washing dishes might be a problem for one person, it won't be for another. While I might have hated doing Taekwondo, there will be people who find great enjoyment out of that. It all exists on a spectrum. Constantly investigate several options until you settle upon something that works best for you. Before I conclude, I want to offer a resource that has helped me immensely, particularly regarding the issue of narrow interest. I recently did a video on my channel where I talk about coaches. These are people who work with mental health sufferers, whether you have autism like me, ADHD, depression, etc. They will work with you either in person, over Skype, or over the phone to help you tackle challenges that might be overwhelming to you. I interviewed my former coach, a guy named John Tucker, who has helped me find things I enjoy doing, as well as advocate for me to my parents, to my school, and to my workplace. Please look in the description box for a link to this interview and see if coaching might be right for you. I highly recommend that you at least check it out. Until next time, my fellow Aspergians, just remember this: you deserve to be happy.